everybody here today. We are coming into a growing season that has an awful lot of questions to it. I know there's a lot of questions about profitability or holding the line ability, however you want to term it. My colleague, in terms of claiming a fairly, well, not so usual name, is going to do a great job for you on that, Bryce Knorr, later on. And it's always fun when Bryce and I are on the same program, because nobody's going to get our name mixed up. You know, all we have to do is go with that. I'd like to bring you greetings from my boss at DTN, Greg Horstmeyer, our editor-in-chief, and also from our division president at DTN, Ron Snyder. We've put a lot of effort, a lot of resources over the years into bringing agricultural news, market information, weather analysis on a pretty local and even now almost precision ag type level, with a weather station project that we've got going for about 2 years now. We have over 3,500 weather stations across the Midwest and into the Canadian prairies that help to even get more down into the detailed scope of how weather is affecting your fields and your production. Well, as I mentioned, looking at this year, it's a year when we start out with a feature in the Pacific called El Nino that generally has a pretty good reputation for its influence on crop production. But we have a little bit of a wrinkle going on, because the second year of an El Nino event in the Pacific, maybe it hasn't been studied that much, but the ramping up of that kind of inquiry has certainly been going on over the past several months. And the second year of an El Nino in the Pacific isn't quite as generous in terms of its weather impact on crops as the first year of an event. And that's where I want to go with this particular discussion today. We do have a robust El Nino out in the Pacific. Now, El Nino is the term given to describe the state of affairs in the Pacific when the equator region of the ocean off the coast of South America and then heading toward the international date line, when that part of the ocean is at a consistent 1 degree Celsius or higher for a period of several months running. That is the temperature description of what El Nino is. Now, on the opposite side, when we have the Pacific in a cooler than normal situation or running, that is when a La Nina is in effect. We are going to likely see both of those to some extent during this growing season. So let's take a look at El Nino right now. The upper right-hand corner of that graphic shows where the water temperatures were in early February. And in February of 1998, that feature had started to decay a little bit. We have the strongest El Nino going in the Pacific since 1998. Now, it looks like those ocean temperatures have reached their top end. It doesn't look like this feature is going to get any stronger. In fact, as we look at the Pacific temperatures right now, we see that from the international date line, that straight up and down line in the left third of this graphic, and then eastward across the equator, there's still a large pool of very warm water. There's no doubt about that. But the hottest area, the warmest core, has definitely shrunk. There's a fairly small core of temperatures that are about 3 degrees Celsius above average. And then off the coast of South America, there's a second circle that I've made there. And over the past month, that water has actually gotten even cooler into a normal to even a little bit below normal scenario just off the coast of Peru and Colombia and Ecuador in western South America. That's where we are at this point. This El Nino is certainly one that has historical strength. We're looking here at some research that was put together by Harlan Shannon and his colleagues at the USDA Weather Analysis Group. And the 2015 and 16 El Nino has the kind of temperature departure from normal, the kind of warmth that we saw in 1997-98, 1982-83, and then in the early 70s, 1972-73. So those are the years where the analysis is mostly focused in terms of what we might see for this year in the Midwest. And again, kind of highlighting those other years. We had 1972-73 when there was a very strong, robust El Nino, 1982-83, 1997-98, and 2015-16. Now, I have also circled another year that doesn't have a year specifically devoted to that identification. That year was 1987 and 88. The reason I bring that up is that there has been some discussion about how the Pacific is going to evolve and affect our growing season as we go through the balance of this year that related back to the 1987 El Nino, then a very strong La Nina in 1988 that hurt crop production drastically here in the Midwest. But for the purposes of identification, that feature doesn't have the performance, it doesn't have the kind of stability or the statistics to it that these other three do. So anyway, that's where we're going to get the body of comparison as we go through our discussion here. Another feature, of course, associated with El Nino is the Southern Oscillation Index, or SOI. I know that you've heard that term before. I think I talked about that at a meeting in Peoria a couple years ago on this same project about how the SOI was acting. And the arrows that I've identified on this graphic show that, that the SOI is a barometer comparison between Darwin, Australia, that's the point on the left in far northern Australia, and the Central Pacific on the island of Tahiti. So those are the two areas where the barometer comparison is analyzed and cataloged each day by the Australia Bureau of Meteorology. And at this point, we have those features in place that still have the Darwin pressure value substantially higher than the Tahiti pressure. So we get a stronger subtropical jet stream from the west to east, moving toward the Western Hemisphere, and El Nino is identified with that barometer feature. Now, how is the SOI evolving? The 30-day values have been at a negative 22. That's a strong El Nino signature. And the 90-day reading is also a strong El Nino signature at a negative 15, almost a negative 15.6. This was as of yesterday. The daily back and forth of the SOI has started to recede a little bit from very strong El Nino levels, but that 90-degree day number I compare to a weekly or a monthly market chart. If you want to see how a market is trending, you want to look, of course, at a weekly or a monthly chart because you know that day to day, prices come and go. It can get kind of noisy. And so you want to look at a little longer scope in order to filter out all of that back and forth in the short term. That's what the 90-day SOI does. In the 90-day SOI, we see that with that negative 15.6 that there is a sustained level of support for that subtropical jet stream out of the Pacific equator moving toward the Western Hemisphere, moving toward the U.S. And that number shows that it's going to take quite a while before the El Nino feature in the Pacific actually loses its strength and its intensity. So we are likely to have El Nino as a weather maker for us in the U.S. certainly all the way through the spring season. That's not necessarily a beneficial situation for everybody, and we have some details that we'll go through on that. But in terms of depicting what the subtropical jet stream looks like with El Nino, the El Nino event on this graphic is identified with that circle. That's the large pool of warm water in the equator region of the Pacific, and then the tracks of arrows moving from west to east out of the central northern Pacific toward North America depict what happens with that jet stream influenced by El Nino. And we are seeing that, we have seen it during this 2015-16 winter in parts of the West Coast, and we've also seen it here in the Midwest and in the Southeast. El Nino certainly is a precipitation maker in the U.S. during the winter season. But each of these events kind of have their own flavor, so to speak. And that's where what is going on this year has a little bit different character to it than what we see in a typical El Nino. The typical El Nino is depicted in the map in the upper left-hand corner of this graphic. And in a typical El Nino, a lot of the California coast and then into South Central and Southern California would be getting above normal precipitation, along with just about the entire southern tier of states, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, through the Gulf Coast. We really haven't seen that this year. Instead, we've had a precipitation pattern that shows up in that lower right-hand corner graphic. In 2015-16, El Nino-related precipitation has focused in the Northwest, in the Pacific Northwest, south to Northern California for the most part, and then farther east, when you get into the greater part of the continental U.S., we see that there's been a pretty good-sized arc of above average precipitation in the southeastern plains and then here into the Midwest. Also, there's an arc from portions of the central plains, then northeast to the Great Lakes, along with the southeastern U.S. The southern plains wheat areas, for the most part, have been bypassed by this El Nino feature. Why am I making such a big deal about this and how we've had this precipitation over the past 90 days? The reason I'm doing that is because a lot of areas that have had some pretty wet conditions during the winter, as we move climatically into spring, are likely to get the bulk of precipitation. And even though there hasn't been a whole lot of market-related concern on how weather is performing, I think that as we have seen in the past, in 5 of the past 7 years, wet conditions at planting time are going to be a feature. We're already seeing that in southeastern Texas, and I know, if you want to kid about Texas, I know everything's bigger. They say they raise more corn there and whatever. Well, yeah, but they do. And they do have at least a fair amount of corn production. Southeastern Texas and then into the southern delta have already gotten some very heavy rains, and they're likely to do it, to have that scenario occur throughout the rest of this calendar winter and then into the springtime. Also in the southeast, you can see that during the meteorological winter season, December, January, February, that those areas had above to much above normal precipitation. We're going to get back to that. The SST sea surface temperature forecast, as we go through the balance of this year, there is some difference because in Australia, the forecast is for those sea surface temperatures to take a little bit of a slide and even reach maybe a weak La Nina, about 0.5 to 1 degree Celsius below average by the fall season into winter. The U.S. model wants to keep El Nino kind of around throughout that same time frame, so there is a little bit of model difference. But in general, forecast models, as analyzed by the International Research Climate Institute in New York at Columbia University, have an El Nino fade going into about late spring, summertime with neutral conditions being in effect, and then by the late summer, August into September, a higher chance for that Pacific temperature to cool enough that La Nina develops at the end of our growing season and then into harvest. So that higher La Nina possibility late summer into fall gets into the yield potential round of discussion as we finish out to go through the balance of this year. We do have good soil moisture. In some cases, there is almost too much. I bring this up because the summer is likely to be a little bit drier, and we're going to need some of that soil moisture reserve, especially in the western corn belt. Along with that, you can see that there is so much of the southeast and even parts of the south central U.S. that have almost a full soil moisture profile. So it's not going to take very much in terms of rainfall to move that into a very wet category, causing some issues as far as field work goes. Now, our forecast is a little bit different than how the NOAA spring forecast has been presented over the past month or so. The NOAA forecast is calling for much of the Corn Belt east of the Mississippi to have normal to below normal precipitation, and we don't think that's shaping up that way. You recall that already there's been an above normal precipitation development here in the Midwest during the winter season, with even with this decaying El Nino, or slowly decaying. And with El Nino still in effect in the spring, as the models depict, research done by Florida State University shows that much of the eastern Corn Belt is in a very wet trend, along with the southeastern plains, delta into the southeast. Again, 5 of the past 7 years, we had some problems with wet fields somewhere in the Corn Belt. 2009, 2011, 2013, 2014, and last year. Now, a year ago, that wet fields situation took a little while to soak its way, if I can use that term, into the trade. It took the trade until mid-June, the week before Father's Day, to get religion on that, but it finally came through, and we did have that question about acreage that shows up almost every year. But in those past 7 years, only in 2010 and 2012 was there a real wide open type of situation for field work. We're already starting out on the wet side. I've taken questions from Arkansas like crazy in the last couple days. Yes, I've only had 2, but that goes along with questions that I fielded at Commodity Classic last week as well. There are folks in the southern part of the country who are getting a little fidgety about how things are going to play out for even being able to get into the field. And the 7-day precipitation forecast map doesn't really help that very much, because the delta stays wet. We share in some of that here in the Midwest. The southwestern plains wheat areas have much lighter precipitation, and the northwest stays very, very wet as well, going through the next 7 days. I showed this graphic at Commodity Classic last Saturday, and there was actually one of these. Oh, yeah, it was somebody from Arkansas. But so this is all starting to go on, and this is part of what happens with an El Nino spring. And as we go through the end of March or the rest of this month and then into April, that doesn't really switch out very much in the south and southeast. 10 to 12 inches plus for rainfall. And even here in the Midwest, we're still in line for 4 to 6 inches. Again, I don't think it's going to take a whole lot to cause some issues in terms of being able to get crops planted on time, or at least in a good, timely fashion. We know we can do an awful lot. I got taught about auto steer here a couple of years ago. I found out just how good that is. And it's incredible technology. Well, we've made the most use of that we can over the last few seasons when there's been just a smaller time frame to be able to get into the field. I think we're going to be doing that again for this year. Now, a little bit ago, I talked about Harlan Shannon at USDA with some research on these years when robust El Niños were in effect and what happened in the second year of that event. Well, this is how it shapes up. Springtime, in the second year of a very strong El Nino, tends to be wet or with above average precipitation. That's on the left map on this graphic. And along with that, temperatures are generally near to below normal. The C stands for cool. The W or the A stands for above. So that's how the spring shapes up. Then when we go into the summertime with a declining El Nino, this is where there's really a big difference overall in the U.S. Corn Belt between what appears to be on track for this year, 2016, as compared with last year, 2015, and in 2014. The last 2 years, our temperatures in the middle part of the summer have been quite favorable. Several times at meetings this winter in Iowa and Minnesota, and then I mentioned at Commodity Classic, I've asked members in the audience how many 90-degree days they had at their place last year. And a couple guys, as soon as I said that, the response was, "Oh, you're asking us that and you're a weatherman." Because, okay, I had one guy from Minnesota who said that he had a 90-degree day last summer. And I think it was probably because the thermometer was on the sunny side of the garage next to the concrete pad with the basketball hoop. That's what we've had going on. This summer is shaping up to be much more of a typical Midwestern summer in terms of temperatures being above average, warm. That's on the right-hand side, the graphic on the right-hand side of this slide, and precipitation, a lot of areas below normal. Illinois has kind of a little bit of variability, but here in northern Illinois, we share the prospect for below normal precipitation along with Wisconsin and eastern Iowa. So that's not a real favorable trend. And you all know after 2012, all the looking that was done at crop production after that year, you all know that, the number one factor particularly in corn production was the temperatures basically during the month of July. Well, we're trending into a warmer to hotter framework for this particular summer. So as a result, this is what I'm looking for, and my colleagues at DTN Ag Weather are also thinking of for the bottom line for this year. El Nino in effect until early summer. During most of the growing season, La Nina development is not likely. Now I'm going to go back to 87, 88, again because that's been talked about a little bit. In 1987, at this time, the Pacific had already reached its maximum on temperatures, and the ocean was moving toward neutral now in early March. In 1997-98, we saw La Nina develop in about mid-August, I should say. 1973, about the same type of development. 1982, 83, 1983 did not really go into La Nina until well into the fall season, around October or so. So anyway, that's the ocean parameter of this. Fieldwork delays, slope planting, I think are quite likely. Warmer summer temperatures are possible. And what about production? In our view, trendline yields may be the top of where we hit this year. That may be the top step, instead of kind of raising the bar like we did in 2014, and then overall, 2015 did quite well also. These are the yield signposts that I'm thinking of. And then I have the other three strong El Nino, post-El Nino years mentioned here. For corn, the longer-term trend that we're working off of is around 165 bushels an acre. 1998, that year, corn production was actually 6% greater than 1997. That was a well-performing year. 1973 was less than 1972. And then in 1983, we had a huge decline. Now, there was already going to be a big decline in corn production in 1983 because that's the year of the famous payment in kind, or PIC program, that took many, many acres out of production. But even so, in 1983, our yields went down by some over 40 bushels an acre because of how hot and dry it turned out to be, basically from the 1st of July, 4th of July on through the end of September. Soybeans, 45 bushels or so is a trend line number there. 1998, we actually did set a record for production that year, up 1% compared with 1997. 1973 was similar, and then just as we saw a big drop in corn production in 1983, 1983 also had a big decline in soybean production. Now I want to get into a couple things regarding the potential for La Nina to develop. Okay, all 3-month periods noted from, again, that forecast model comparison on the sea surface temperature forecast. So La Nina chances get higher as we go through the end of this calendar year. Now please focus your attention on the impact of La Nina, particularly in South America. When La Nina is in effect in South America, there is a very high relationship between that going on, cooler water in the Pacific and so forth, and below average rainfall in Argentina and southern Brazil. So if La Nina sets up shop in that September timeframe or thereabouts, if we want to get an indication, a sign, a signal that La Nina is indeed in effect, making itself to home, so to speak, look at how things start out for the South American season in Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil and across Argentina. If they have a dry start, that's going to indicate that they may have some problems in terms of their crop year for production in 2016 and 17. And it can be bad. When La Nina is around, we had that feature going on in the 2010, 2011 timeframe. Argentina's crop production definitely took a hit. That is a feature that bears watching as far as what it does to world production. How are things looking now in South America, by the way? Well, Brazil has really turned things around, and after a slow start to the fieldwork season there back in October or so, the rainfall has returned to the point that there is adequate to surplus soil moisture in the majority of their primary row crop areas, and Brazil is on track to kick out 100 million metric tons of soybeans. This is a picture that an agronomist with a big farm outfit in Mato Grosso made available. We're looking at the Sapazal district in Mato Grosso. Maybe you've had a chance to go there and actually see what it looks like firsthand. Those are good-looking soybeans, and yes, the fleets are out in terms of the combine array to bring that crop in. They have some wet conditions right now, but it doesn't look like it's going to cause a real big loss in terms of production. And over in Argentina, They have very few dry areas. I've circled in the red where things have been the driest, but northern portions of western Argentina and then the southern part of their crop belt have some dryness. But in general, El Nino has been a rainmaker. There are some private estimates that push the Argentina soybean production up to 60 million tons. That's a very good crop. And corn production around 25 million metric tons or so. Certainly not a problem in Argentina for production this year. One of our big competitors over the last, well, certainly in the last 5 years that has developed is Ukraine, the whole Black Sea region you've heard so much about. Soil moisture in Ukraine is right now adequate to surplus in almost all areas except a little bit in the southwest. So going into their corn and row crop season, they should start out with pretty decent soil moisture. In Russia, there is favorable soil moisture across the majority of their crop belt, thinking here mainly of wheat. The crop does have hardly any snow cover. So yeah, if there's a quick March cold snap that moves in, there could be some damage there. But right now, that's not in the forecast. And they've had very mild temperatures along with southeastern Europe. And then finally in China, the soil moisture is pretty decent. There are very few dry areas in late winter. There's a little bit of dryness in parts of northeast China, but the primary soybean belt, or their soybean province of Heilongjiang in the far northeast of China has pretty decent moisture. And in the North China Plain, it's a little bit dry, but that's primarily wheat areas. And at this point, that's not a real big concern. Those are some of the main crop areas internationally I wanted to mention. So that's what I wanted to bring out again. The bottom line for this year is that here in the north central part of the belt, I think we're going to have a better situation for field work than we see farther to our south and to our southeast. May have a few delays. I do think that the north central belt on west has a better scenario, a better situation for field work than we will see, say, from the central part of Illinois, east and then southeast, all the way through the Delta and so forth, like we're getting already. And then for the summertime, this cool pattern that we had in the last 2 summers has likely come to an end. More normal summer temperatures, more typical for that time of year. And again, production takes somewhat of a setback from where we've seen it. Are we in for a tremendous drop like we saw in 2012? I don't think we are. In 2012 at this time, northwest Iowa, for example, the northwestern, almost half of Iowa was already in level 2 drought, severe drought. And you saw by our soil moisture depiction that there isn't that sort of an issue right now, and the latest drought monitor has basically nothing for drought concerns here across the Midwest. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to take them. This is a great chance to visit.
Dr. Rice?
Yeah, Dan.
If you just kind of compare 2012 to where we're at here in 16.
As far as moisture is concerned?
Moisture, but the El Nino and Nino was in 2012, so what we're going to in 2016. Is there any comparisons there? Okay,
Dan asked if there was a comparison between what we've got going on this year and then 4 years ago in 2012. Right now, it looks like we are looking at two different years in terms of what we've got going into the season for our available soil moisture. In 2012, we were actually coming out of a pretty strong La Nina that began in late summer of 2010. I just want to review what we had for corn production from 2009 through 2012. And if I miss a number, holler at me, and we'll give you a free Progressive Farmer subscription. Okay. 2009, 165. on corn production. At that time, that was a record. 2010, production slipped to just over 151 bushels an acre. We went down by 14 bushels an acre in 2010. And so that had a La Nina signature to it. And then in 2011, La Nina was still in place. Yields slipped to 147. And then in 2012, we actually had La Nina activity in the upper atmosphere winds clear into June. And in 2012, all of us remember what happened. Corn production that year nationally had a yield of only about 123.4.5 bushels an acre. And then we got back into more of what we would think of as normal production in 2013, and then in 2014 we did that record that was close to 170 bushels an acre. USDA is working off a trend yield, by the way, of 168. I don't know how others view that. In our view, that's a little bit high. We're using 165. So that's how, that's the difference. And we certainly have much more moisture in our soils now to help us out than we did 4 years ago.
Other questions? I have one. If you look forward, what's the impact of La Nina, which will be in play, I suppose, by the time we get to next fall at some point? Is that correct?
Yeah.
And what's the impact on the following growing season in South America?
Okay. Okay. Are you talking, Todd, are you talking about the South America growing season that would happen starting this fall?
This fall.
2016?
When they go into planning for the 2016-17 crop.
Okay. If La Nina sets up for the, for the time frame sometime this fall, let's just use October as a ballpark month, you would see a drier temperature, response in Argentina and southern Brazil. Then in January, which is their equivalent of July, when their corn, soybeans get, definitely into the reproductive time frame, if La Nina gets going, they are going to turn off hot and dry. And when it turns off hot and dry in Argentina, it can do it with a vengeance. I mean, it really ramps up. That would also then ripple northward into Rio Grande do Sul and possibly even to Paraná in Brazil. Rio Grande do Sul is the #3 soybean state in Brazil. Paraná is #2, and of course Mato Grosso kind of, dwarfs them all. Mato Grosso is like 30% of the Brazil soybean production or something like that. But there certainly could be an adverse impact in terms of hurting that South America crop.
Other questions?
I also want to mention that if La Nina stays in effect through 2017, then we're going to start, having some moisture concerns here in the States in all likelihood as well.
Anybody else? Yeah, right here. Warren?
What's the cause of La Nina? Is it underwater volcano or just circulation of the ocean?
How is the El Nino caused?
It's due to just a sustained long-range, long-term circulation of the waters in the Pacific. The Pacific moves back and forth between, the Asian coast and the Western Hemisphere coast, the Americas, and it's that long-term, not only surface waves but also deep ocean waves in their interaction that cause those changes in terms of warming or cooling relative to normal. And it has gone on for a long, long time. The earliest identification was during the 1600s or so, when Spanish soldiers heard about some feature that happened around Christmas time that actually was a cause of production problems for the fishermen in Peru. And that's where El Nino came in because its relationship to Christmas and the Christ child. But it's just this sustained back and forth of the oceans that causes those temperature features.
The name is Little Boy, or probably Little Jesus, Little Boy. So El Nino, it's related, the two are.
Correct. El Nino is little boy, and La Nina is little girl.
Yeah. And the meteorologist made the La Nina part up. That's something.
Pretty much. Yeah.
Let's grow a second crop of soybeans in Argentina. I've heard that.
Can they grow a second crop of soybean in Argentina?
In parts of northern Argentina, that would be possible. From the central part of the country, say Buenos Aires on south, their growing season would not allow that. But Argentina does extend quite a ways north, and into closer to a subtropical climate, and so they would have a chance to do that.
So it's a decent.
In parts of Argentina, yeah, it's possible.
Anybody else?
Yeah, John.
Oh, John.
John.
Suppose we do get the crop in, what's fall going to be like with La Nina? Or El Nino?
Yeah.
Wait, you're suggesting you won't get the crop in?
Well, assuming you
said,
do.
I'm sorry. He said, suppose we do get the crop in. I said, yeah, you'll get the crop in. So what kind of fall?
Well, that is one real benefit when La Nina in the fall season is in effect, because we generally have a drier pattern during the fall with La Nina going on. Now there is one wrinkle to that, and that has to do with the relationship between La Nina and tropical storm activity here in the Midwest. Because if La Nina is in effect in the Pacific, the subtropical jet stream subsides notably. It pretty well dies off. And that allows tropical weather systems to form and kind of reach full blossom, full flower in the Atlantic and in the Gulf. So that's another part of it. So in the absence of tropical storms, La Nina would help us out at harvest with fairly dry conditions. In 2011, La Nina was in effect, and it was so dry that in quite a few areas of the Midwest, at least in the Western Corn Belt, there were a number of occurrences of combine fires because dry crops and dry ground and everything caused some pretty big time sparks, and there were some pretty spectacular combine fires that happened with that.
Give Bryce Anderson a nice round, please.
Thank you, everyone.
First